Hello, class. Herbert Hoover is the only president to have been born in Iowa. Herbert Hoover was born in West Branch, Iowa on August 10th, 1874, and then he died October 20th, 1964. He was the age of 90. Right? So his home state is Iowa. He was born here. He's buried here. Though he lived large parts of his adult life in other places, including California. By matter of religion, Herbert Hoover was a Quaker. Herbert Hoover was married to a woman named Lou. They got married when he was 25, but she dies in 1944, an entire 20 years before her husband, so he has quite a long widowhood. His two sons, one which becomes prominent, Herbert Hoover Jr., is going to be a cabinet secretary for President Eisenhower. So, as a matter of political party, Herbert Hoover is a Republican. He is the third Republican in a row. His term in office was from March 4th, 1929 to March 4th, 1933. And his vice president was Charles Curtis. Charles Curtis is notable because he was biracial, and the fact that his parentage was mixed between a Native American and a European, him having grown up as a member of a tribe. All right, so Herbert Hoover, if he had never become president, he still might have a place in the history books. He was an incredibly successful businessman, specifically in mining. And he did a great job building up his business empire, especially because he did not grow up extravagantly wealthy. He could speak, him and his wife could speak fluent Mandarin, and so he spent a lot of time overseas. And so when he was managing one of his mines in China is when the Boxer Rebellion breaks out. And so he has to shelter in place during the Boxer Rebellion with some American troops. Given that he was a foreign businessman, there's a high likeliness that if he had just kept on doing what he was doing, and the Boxers had gotten to him, he probably would not have survived. So, a man of extravagant wealth. Then World War I breaks out. And a lot of the fighting is occurring in the nation of Belgium, which is officially neutral. It's being affected by the fight, and the people of Belgium are starving. So Herbert Hoover is going to lead the effort using much of his own money to make sure the people of Belgium get fed. So he's credited for saving Belgium during World War I. And that goes with his philosophical beliefs that rich people had an obligation to help people struggling, and that rich people could do this more efficiently than any government could. So he becomes Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge, and is quite popular there. He may have been the first person to appear on a TV broadcast. His office when he was in Secretary of Commerce is standardized the stop light system of red, yellow, and green. And so he was quite popular as Commerce Secretary. And so he gets the Republican nomination in 1928. And this is the last time that someone has gone from being a cabinet secretary to being their party's nominee, making this jump. Cabinet secretary, specifically Secretary of State, used to be a big launching pad for careers. It no longer is. So, Herbert Hoover is a rare president that had no elected experience before running for office. He also had no military experience. They had worked in government. So, he's going to pretty easily win the election of 1928. Okay? His opponent is the Democratic governor of New York, a guy called Al Smith. And the thing to know about Al Smith is he's a Catholic. And at this time, this is a big deal. So Hoover is personally popular, but there's a lot of backlash against Smith and his Catholicism, which allows Hoover to make inroads into the South that were atypical for a Republican. So he comes in with a pretty big mandate. Then the Great Depression hits during his term. And the entire economy collapses. It's the worst economic crisis that's happened in American history. And when he goes for re-election in 1932, it's going to be a landslide defeat. And so these two maps, there's a handful of counties in Iowa that most of them are quite Catholic at the time. They go for Al Smith, but Hoover's cleaning up, and then he barely wins any counties in Iowa in 1932. And so Hoover gets blamed for the Great Depression. Right? A not entirely fair thing to thrust entirely to one man. But the policies that had been continued to be enacted by the last three presidents definitely helped lead to the crisis. So he gets blamed for it. The Republican Party gets tarred their image at the time for this and will not win another presidential election for 20 years. And so people are really hurting, and they start living in these shacks and these encampments because they're so impoverished. And they are ironically named Hoovervilles, right, as an attack to Hoover. So Hoover's out of office in 1933, and he ends up being at that time, he is the only former president. Franklin Roosevelt stays in office for 12 years, and then he dies in office. Then Harry Truman's in office. So it's not until the 1950s that Herbert Hoover isn't the only former president. Okay, so it's a really lonely group there. And he lives for quite a long time. He died in 1964. He outlived President Kennedy, who was assassinated. One of the things that Herbert Hoover gives value to also is his contribution to the presidential library system. We take this for granted now, but before Herbert Hoover, they weren't regularly presidential libraries. So because he had this long post-presidency in West Branch, Iowa, which is not a large town, there is Herbert Hoover's presidential library, in which he was able to be involved in recreating his childhood home, and putting through his papers and trying to explain his presidency. So, Herbert Hoover will forever be remembered as the man that was at the helm when the Great Depression occurred. He had a much more complex life than that. Next time, we'll talk about his successor, Franklin Roosevelt.